and that to some extent has stimulated some of the work that we've been doing. The second person involved is our own Richard Deacon. Richard's name is going to come up later in this little talk, but he has been vigorously pursuing the history of the estate of Cogenhoe and the way in which it's split up in the 19th and 20th century. And lastly, of course, Diane Overt. Diane is our go-to lady on things like genealogy, family trees. And there's been a complete exchange of emails that have been going on to the degree that we now all have nicknames, which I'm rather embarrassingly going to share with you. Diane is called Squirrel, and Richard is called Squirrel too, and I'm Mole. Now I know that's silly. I mean, I know we're grown-up people and we shouldn't be really talking to one another in that way, but that's what's happened. And because we have done a lot of research, we've created an order called the Order of the Golden Acorn. And if you do something really exceptional, you get awarded a golden acorn. So last time we were together, about 2 years ago, we talked about villages and how villages were different. There's 4,700 of them in this country. And what's amazing about them is just the diversity of them. The fact that each one is different. Each one has his own personality. And if you were standing in the middle of Lower Hayford, you would never get confused with the fact that you might be standing in the middle of Earls Barton or some other village. It's amazing that all 4,700 villages have their own personality, their own dynamic. And of course, our village is no different to that. And the reason why villages are different is, there are a lot of reasons, but there are twofold. Mainly, the first one is geography and the nature of the village. Is it on a river? Is it on a hill? Is it in a valley? And so on and so forth. But much more importantly than that is the people who lived in those villages, and the people who made big decisions, prime decisions that affected the future of the village. And what we have been doing is looking at those key people and trying to learn a little bit more about them, how they lived their lives, even where they lived, if we could. And in that work, we've decided this evening to beam in on the 18th century. John, if you could bring the first slide up. Is it up? Because I can't see it.
It's one with all the arrows on.
One with, no, it should say Cogenhoe in the 18th century.
Sorry, that was the second. The golden age of village life.
No, the one before that. Cogenhoe in the 18th.
Yeah, Cogenhoe in the 18th century is up now, yeah.
Okay, because I can't actually see the slide. Now, I just wanted to talk a little bit about why this evening we've chosen the 18th century, which is 1700 to 1800. What is particularly unusual about the 18th century? Well, those of you who know your history will know that the 18th century was the first century where there was complete peace and tranquility in England. The previous century had been bedeviled by the Civil War. We're going to talk a little bit about that, the impact of that on the village. But the 18th century was a century of agricultural expansion. The 19th century, of course, had the Industrial Revolution, where villages changed because of the mechanization of agriculture and because of the growth of industrial centers. But the 18th century was a period of agrarian growth. It was a period of peace and prosperity. So the 18th century was something that we can think of in terms of church, very important, land, equally important, and titles. So we're going to think of the 18th century in terms of church, land, and titles. John, could you bring up the next slide?
Yeah.
So this period was the golden age of village life. There's some historians that will disagree with that, but that's the way I'm viewing it. It was a period of peace, it was a period of prosperity, and it was a period of security in English villages. Now, of course, there were economic cycles as you went through the century, and there were some disturbances, but nearly all the wars that England were involved in during that period were abroad. They were on the continent of Europe, and the only significant incursion was the Jacobite Revolution of 1745, where the Scots army got down as far as Derby and then turned north again. But apart from that, the people of Cogenhoe during that period could live in relative security and in relatively prosperity. And this was again before the pre-industrial age, where the fastest thing was a horse and cart, and where labour was manual and has yet to be mechanised. During that period, there was developed a social hierarchy that was relatively rigid, relatively understood. And if you want to identify with that social hierarchy, think about Jane Eyre, think about Pride and Prejudice, think about her books, and you begin to get a feel for what the social scene in Cogenhoe would have been at that time. And in that social hierarchy, there were three essentially groups of people. I'm oversimplifying. The first one was what was loosely called the Gentry. And the Gentry were the people who owned the land, who owned the big asset. And they were generally called the Gentry. And then at the bottom of the pile were the labourers, the people who worked. And in between those two were a group of people who later became known as yeomen. And that was the development of the agricultural middle class. And eventually that agricultural middle class began to aspire to be gentry and to aspire to land ownership. So if we think about the gentry, we think about the growing middle class, the yeomans, and we think about the labourers. And we're going to try and take that division and relate it specifically to Cogenhoe. If you could take that slide off, John, and come back to me.
No, I can't yet. I can't really. Okay.
I'll just continue talking then.
Yeah.
Now, what I'm going to start with is I'm going to go back from the 1700 to the 1645 and to the English Civil War, because this is where this period of growth and prosperity started. And we in schools, we think about the Civil War, we read about it in books. We know about Cavaliers and Roundheads, but we don't think about the devastating impact that that Civil War had on the villages and towns of England, and the devastating impact that it had on Cogenhoe. And I want to quickly draw a little picture of Cogenhoe in the 1645 period, and you'll get a feel for what was happening in our village at the time. The first thing to mention, of course, is that when I was writing a book on the First World War, I rather glibly said that the death rate in the First World War was the highest of any war in English history. And historians quickly corrected me, it wasn't. In the English Civil War, 10 out of every 100 men between the ages of 18 and 50 were killed, which is much higher than in the First World War. So this was a period of high death rate. But in Cogenhoe, what was happening? Well, the first thing we have to say about Cogenhoe is that the lord of the manor at the time was a chap called Sir Charles Chain. He was a royalist. He was a commander in the Royalist Army. He didn't live in Cogenhoe, he lived in Buckinghamshire. He fought at Edge Hill. And after Edge Hill, he went into exile. And he went to Spain and he went to Italy. And he didn't come back to this country until 1655. So the first thing is that Cogenhoe didn't have a lord of the manor during this time. Worse than that, it didn't have an estate agent here either. Earlier, the estate agent was a chap called Norwood, who lived in the manor house, and not the manor house we have now. We'll talk about that later, but he lived in the manor house. And he left in about 1629. A chap called Coles, you're going to hear that name a lot, Coles. Terry, no relationship to you, I'm sure. A chap called Coles became the estate agent, and he left. So there wasn't a lord of the manor, and there wasn't an estate agent. And we know from this time that the church was in very poor repair. We know that the mill, most of the time, wasn't working. And we know that many of the fields in a strict field system were fallow. So here was a village without a lord of the manor, without an estate agent. In other words, it was close to chaotic. In addition to that, of course, the Puritan ethic, which took over from after the Civil War, changed church practices. Things like things that smacked of popery, like Christmas, like Easter, like religious festivals were banned. The legal requirement to go to church on a Sunday was taken away. So the structure of the lives of the villagers in Cogenhoe was also changed. To make matters worse, we know that Cogenhoe itself was raided for food and victuals. And if you could bring up the map, Terry, of the Civil War map.
Yeah.
You got that?
Yeah.
What I put up here is a quick map, which it shows the movement of the Parliamentary Army before Naseby. It started off at Newport Pagnell, went up through Grafton Regis, up through Kislingbury to get to Naseby, and a few days later, that was Fairfax's army. A few days later, Cromwell's new army, the cavalry, came up through Olney, went to Stoke Goldington, and came up through Hardingstone in order to get to Naseby. And we know from documentation that that army was not fed by its own resources. It fed off the land. And 2 detachments of soldiers were sent to Cogenhoe from Hardingstone. They purloined, demanded 11 dozen loaves of bread, 40 pounds of cheese, many bushels of wheat, and a big quantity of wood. And they demanded that those be taken from Cogenhoe in carts to Hardingstone. In addition to that, next door neighbours, Castle Ashby, Sir William Compton was a major leader in the Royalist Army. And we know from documentation that he raised a regiment from the villages around Castle Ashby. And we know that at least one of those people, possibly 2, but one of those people, a chap called Harris, came from Cogenhoe. And he was involved in the Scottish campaigns, and he was also involved in the siege of Banbury. So the picture that I'm drawing of you for you in 1645 is a village devastated and starving, without a lord of the manor, with a Puritan ethic in the church. At this time, both the Spicer, John Spicer and his son Christopher, who were mentioned later, tended towards the Puritan view. So this is a picture of a village in dire trouble, and a village that was similar to many other villages around. So what I'm going to do now is, from that start point, from that low, I'm going to try and draw a picture of what happened in the next 130, 140 years and pick out some high spots. Now, we're very lucky because we know quite a lot about the village at this time. And we know it because we have two documents that most other villages don't have. John, could you bring up the Spicer survey document? Just tell me when it's on. Yeah. Okay. If Cogenhoe has a claim to fame, it has a claim to fame because it was the village that is attributed to having the first real village census in the country. And this is called the Spicer Census. It was started by John Spicer, who was rector of the church, and it was continued by his son Christopher. And it was a census of everybody who lived in the village, their children, the burials, the baptisms, over a period of about 15, 16 years. And over that period, some of the documentation has been lost, but we are in the process of, or should I say, Diane is in the process of unraveling the minute detail in the Spicer survey, but I'm going to refer to it a little bit later on. The second document we have, and John, if you could bring up the slide of the Norwood map.
Yeah.
Okay. Is we have this map that was made in 1630 by Richard Norwood, who was a kinsman of the Norwood, who was the estate agent in the manor house. You remember I mentioned his name, and it's a very detailed map. And the late and great and very dear Joe Aindo redrew it for us, which is what you're looking at now. And what you're looking at is a detailed map of the centre part of the village. We know at this time that there were 33 houses in the village. There was a lot of outhouses. The population was between 150 and 180 people. Remember that, because we're going to visit the village again 200 years later. 150 and 180 people. And of course, with the exception of the mill on the northern part of this map and the cotton farm on the southern part of this map, everything was collected around the street, or Church Street as we now know it. Now, if you walk down that road in 1645, you wouldn't really recognize the village. You would recognize the church, of course, that had already largely been built. And the rectory would have been something that you would know where it was, but the rest of the houses you wouldn't recognize. Most of them were one-story thatched houses and not something that was familiar. But we have those two documents which give us a start point for what we're going to be talking about a little bit later. So let's go into this period where we talked about church, land and title. And we now, first of all, need to just find out in Cogenhoe, who were the gentry? Who were they? What did they do? And where did they live? And John, if you could bring up the slide of the, which is headed up the Cogenhoe estate.
Yep, it's there.
Okay. I've simplified this for everybody, but it essentially tells the story. We see at the top here Sir Charles Chain, who we've already talked about. Sometime or another, we'll give a talk on Sir Charles Chain, because when he came back from exile, he got to know King Charles II. He married Jane Cavendish, the heiress daughter of the Duke of Newcastle, the great Cavendish family that now owns Chatsworth. And so Sir Charles Chain, from being an exiled guy with no property suddenly became a very important man. He was eventually made Viscount Newhaven. And unfortunately, because of his newfound stature, he decides that he wants to sell his estates and buy the estate of Chelsea next to the Thames, which he does. So in 1655, Sir Charles Chain sells Cogenhoe. By the way, you will know the famous Chain Walk down by the Thames. Well, that's how it's got its name. But what he did was something unusual. I guess in terms to maximize his income, he decided to sell the manor separately to the living. So here we see the first time that the estate is split into two, and we see the beginnings of the domain land, which were owned by the manor, and the glebe lands, which were owned by the living. So we're going to talk a little bit about the manor on the left-hand side of your chart. And he sold the manor to one Matthew Linwood. Matthew Linwood was a man of a very different type. Matthew Linwood was an industrialist, an artisan, a nouveau riche man. No titles, no aristocracy. He had made his money out of business in Leicester, and he aspired to be a member of the Gentry. So he bought Cogenhoe from Sir Charles Chain. Think about the change between old nobility, title, now to a artisan lord of the manor. But Matthew Linwood was a goer. He was a doer. And the more we learn about Matthew Linwood, the more we actually like him. Because he started the development of what we now know as Church Street. He pulled down the old manor house and he built the manor house as it now stands, more or less as it stands. There have been some changes, but the manor house that you look at as you walk down Church Street was the manor house that Matthew Linwood built. He built the Dowager House, which is where Heather McNichol now lives. He built that. He built the house that's just over the road from where the Dowager House is. And also, probably a bit earlier than Manor House, he rebuilt Manor Farm. So you're beginning to see the village as we currently would know it. And during the next 30 to 40 years, the buildings, the old buildings on the right-hand side and the left-hand side, John, no doubt you'll tell us later when your house was built, but the buildings on the right-hand side and the left-hand side and those surrounding the green began to take shape. And most of those that weren't built by Linwood were built by what we're going to investigate a little bit later, which is the Yeoman Farmers built them. So Cogenhoe was beginning to take his shape because of the work that Matthew Linwood did. You will also notice that Matthew Linwood on this chart married Matthew Linwood the second, by the way, because he died and his son, also Matthew Linwood, inherited from him, married Martha Whalley. And the Martha Whalley is the daughter of Peter Whalley, who had bought the living on the right-hand side of this chart. This is the beginning of a whole series of intermarriages between people in the village as they try to augment their social standing and augment their wealth. But Matthew Linwood fell on hard times. He fell on hard times, it would appear, because his businesses in Leicester collapsed. And there's references in documents that he probably became a bankrupt. We're not too sure about that. So he sold the Cogenhoe estate, the manor lands, because he had no choice. I'm just going to put in a side here. After Matthew Linwood sold the estate, he moved to the Birmingham area, and his fortunes of his family turned very positive very quickly. His daughter married a silversmith, and they created a silver business, highly ornate, highly decorated, and they became the national name in silverware that was being bought by both the Gentry and the Yeoman Farmers of this period. Not only that, I think it was his granddaughter became very famous indeed as a seamstress. She was a confidant of Queen Victoria, of Catherine the Great. She became a very important person in her own right. But that was after they'd left Cogenhoe, and maybe another time we can do a talk on the Linwood family. What Matthew Linwood did is he sold the Cogenhoe estate to one John Palmer. Now, John Palmer was a man, again, very different. He was the grandson of another John Palmer, who was Archdeacon of Northampton, a very rich and a very powerful churchman. So the Palmers were churchmen. And not only were the Palmers churchmen, is that they were an Ecton family. And this is the beginnings of a trend that you'll see in the next 50 or 60 years, where Cogenhoe becomes subservient, if I can use that expression, to Ecton. So he sells it to John Palmer. We do, fortunately, have a picture of John Palmer. John, if you could bring up the picture of John Palmer. There he is. And if you think that the research project is narrow, you will notice that this picture was found in the Yale Center in Boston. And you can see that it says another John Palmer, because his grandfather was John Palmer, Lord of the Manor at Cogenhoe, Northamptonshire, date 1749. So we do have a picture of him. Unfortunately, John Palmer died relatively young. Could you go back, John, to the chart of Cogenhoe estate? In other words, go back, not forwards.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep, done.
John Palmer had a pretty big family, but unfortunately, nearly all of them died, and they were left with an heiress. And the heiress's name was Barbara Palmer. Now, I've got a bit of a fantasy about Barbara Palmer. I mean, she's straight out of a Jane Eyre novel, isn't she? She's wonderfully attractive. She's extremely feisty, and she's probably ridiculously rich. And who could possibly resist such a girl? We're going to come back to Barbara Palmer because she was nothing like that. And we'll tell you what she was really like a little bit later. So we've got the manor now. We've got the manor with Palmer, Barbara Palmer, without a lord of the manor, with the lady of the manor, but we'll see that that lady of the manor wasn't going to be there for very much longer. So if we go over to the other side of this diagram and we look at what happened to the living, what happened to the glebe lands and who received the tithes that came in from the glebe lands. Glebe lands, Eddie probably has a much more accurate number, but it looks like they were between 1/3 and 40% of the village by this time. And he sold those to Peter Whalley. You've heard about the Whalley name, and this is where it first appears. He sold it in a complicated process, so there were some intermediaries, but it ended up with Peter Whalley, who was also a churchman. He was also a businessman, and he was also part of a family from Ecton. So now we've got both sides of this estate involved with Ecton. But Peter Whalley was the fourth son of his father, and he came to live in Cogenhoe, and he lived in the rectory. He had all his children here. He was buried in the churchyard, as was his wife. And he would consider himself a Cogenhoe man. And with Matthew Linwood, he would consider himself the Gentry of the village. When Peter Whalley died, the lands were inherited, or the tithes to the lands were inherited by his son Bradley Whalley. By this time, we described the Whalleys as churchmen, but they were property owners, really, because they collected rectorships like lords of the manor collected manor. And at some times, the Whalleys were rectors at Cogenhoe. They were rectors at St Giles in Northampton. They were rectors of the very rich St Sepulchre's in Northampton. And for a while also, they were rectors of Wilby. And of course, they were also, for a while, rectors of Ecton. So Bradley Whalley inherited a lot of these. He did live in Cogenhoe. He lived in the rectory. And I think he died in Cogenhoe as well. And he passed his inheritance on to heir Whalley, who you see on this diagram. And of all the Whalleys, if you forgive the expression, heir Whalley was probably the most notable. But he was essentially an Ecton man. He, for example, those of you who know the rectory at Ecton, which is called Ecton House, opposite the church at Ecton, he largely rebuilt that, and he lived nearly all his life in Ecton. And just like any Jane Eyre novel, he married Barbara Palmer. So the two families that were in Cogenhoe and had the living and had the manor were reunited in marriage. Now we know a little bit about Barbara Palmer and heir Whalley because, and we know it through none other than Benjamin Franklin, founder of one of the founders of the United States, who, as you know, his family came from Ecton, and he visited Ecton, and he had a correspondence. He had tea, by the way. He had correspondence with heir Whalley, and that correspondence found its way into the Smithsonian Institute in Washington, which we have been able to access that correspondence. And here we learn a little bit more about Barbara Palmer. All my fantasies have been squashed. She is described by Benjamin Franklin as a rather rotund. He uses the word rotund, not very kind when you're talking about a lady. And he also uses the word garrulous. So you're beginning to get a picture. But heir Whalley, learned, sophisticated, and what I think he called him a man of letters. He called him a man of letters, and obviously Benjamin Franklin rather liked heir Whalley. What happened after heir Whalley died is that the estate was split between the Whalleys and the Watkins. You will notice that Bradley Whalley, his sister, had married Edward Watkins, and the rectorship passed down through the Watkins. I'm not going to go into that in any detail. That's for the 19th century. But what I want to emphasize now is that neither the rector or the rectory or the manor house were lived in by gentry. The gentry lived elsewhere. And in the rectory was a curate or a parson, or call you what they will. And in the manor house was an estate agent. So it means that during this period of time, at the end of this period, Cogenhoe didn't have any gentry living in it. And that has an influence over the way in which the village operated and how society was structured. So that's the gentry. What I want to turn to now is the next layer of society. And we're going to call them the Yeoman Farmers. I think if you can bring up that slide, which got Yeoman Farmers on it, John.
Yeah.
Okay. So we're looking at the next layer of society, and Yeoman Farmers, Cogenhoe had a plenty. And we're just going to see if we can find out who they were and find out where they lived and found out what they did. And we're going to unpeel this onion a little bit. Now, what were yeoman farmers? You've heard the word before, the yeoman of England, the backbone of England. This was a new aspiring middle class that had grown out of the prosperity of peace and agricultural production. Most yeoman farmers farmed their land, most of which they owned. But in Cogenhoe, it appeared they didn't own it, but they leased it from the either from the manor or from the living. So the yeoman farmers of Cogenhoe weren't owners; they had right to the lease, and they could pass that lease on father to son and pass it on down through the family. So an agricultural middle class which emerged all over England and which became synonymous with Englishness and steadfastness and consistency. So who were these yeoman farmers? How can we find out who they were, and how can we find out where they lived or what they did? So to do that, John, if we could go to the next slide, which got electoral roll on the right-hand side and Spicer survey on the left.
Yeah.
So what we're looking at here is excerpts from the Spicer survey. And as I said, we're not going to go into detail on the Spicer survey. But what we've done is plucked from the Spicer survey some interesting names. And bear in mind, we're talking about 1628. That long ago, okay. And the first name I want you to beam in on is Kilsby. This is the first time maybe you've heard the name, and it isn't a name we know in Cogenhoe now, but the Kilsby family were going to become a prime yeoman farmer family of Cogenhoe, and they were going to become very important, and we'll see them later on. We're going to track a little bit the Kilsby, and you will keep hearing the name as we go through this period. Now, there is one other name there that I just want to dwell on, and that's the name of Dorcas Hoare. And Dorcas Hoare is of interest from a number of different points of view. At the time of the survey, she had 3 children. I think she had more children, and the Hoares were also going to become a family that persisted in Cogenhoe throughout the 18th century. And there is a connection here to one of our own members, and Richard Grace. I don't know how I'm going to say this because I can't use any other words, but we know now that Richard Deacon is descended from a Hoare. I can't find any other words, which I apologise. But we now know that the Hoares married into the Sharmans, and the Sharmans, of course, is part of Richard's ancestry. So Richard is now busy with Diane tracing his family tree all the way back to this Dorcas Hoare in 1628, all the way through to the present day. But that maybe is another talk sometime in the future. What I want to now do, John, if you could just bring up the next column.
Yeah.
This is the 1702 electoral roll for Cogenhoe. And it is illuminating in its own right, but you will notice the Kilsbys are there. Well, first of all, you will notice that the Walleys and the Linwoods are there. So they're the gentry at this time. They're the people who rule the roost. We've got Peter Walley, we've got Bradford Walley, and we've got Nathaniel Linwood, Lord of the Manor. But we've also got the Kilsbys. And by this time, there are 2 Kilsbys who can vote. So the family is diversifying, multiplying. But at this stage, I want you also to beam in on another name. and that name is the name of Richard Sibley, which you see just from the bottom there. And just like the Kilsbys, the Sibleys are going to become a prime yeoman farmer family of Cogenhoe, and they're going to become very significant. The Kilsbys, I think Jenny will probably know, the Kilsbys have a plaque in the church, and the Sibleys have a box tomb in the churchyard, which reflects to some extent their position. Now, if we go on to the next column, we're going to move to 1730, and you will notice two things happening. You will notice that in 1702, there were 22 people in Cogenhoe who could vote. And in 1730, there were only 12. This is because there's a 1710 Parliamentary Act. And the 1710 Parliamentary Act stipulated that you had to have an income or assets of £600 or more in order to vote. So what that did is it reduced the electoral roll. In our day and age, we think of the onward march of democracy as being a never-ending process. That's not true. During this period, democracy went backwards, and less people were able to vote during the time period, and the vote depended on asset, which eventually depended on land. So you'll see that by 1730, only 12 people could vote, and you'll see here they're beginning to take shape. Bradley Wally's there, Matthew Linwood's there, the Kilsbys can vote, as can the Sibleys. And also you will notice that 3 other names are appearing. That's the name of Smith, the name of Green, and the name of Bedford. And we'll see those names coming on later on. They're not as significant in the village history as the Kilsby and the Sibleys, but they are important in their own right. And now we're going to shoot through to 1748. And you'll see the Kilsbys are still there. You'll see the Linwoods are there. You'll see the Sibleys are there. And now the number of people who can vote in the village is only 8.
Gosh.
Land is powerful. Land gives you influence. And what happens as it does in most of the world, the big fish eat the little fish. And the Kilsbys and the Sibleys became more significant by taking over the strips. Bear in mind, we've still got a strip farming system in the village, by taking over the strips from other farmers, and those farmers became labourers, and the yeoman farmers became bigger and more important. So we're beginning to see a pattern. Now, by the time we get to the middle of the century, Kilsbys, the Sibleys, the Greens, the Bedfords are the yeoman farmers. They form the society underneath the Gentrys, which is the Walleys and the Linwoods. So what we decided to do is have a look at one of these families in some great detail. Now, when I say we, I'm using the royal we. Actually, Diane did all this. So if I take the credit for it, Diane, I apologize, but you know what I'm like. So what we're going to do now is we're going to have a look at the Sibley family. Second in importance behind the Kilsbys in our village. And we're going to see a little bit about the dynamics of that family and how they got to where they got. And what I'm going to ask you to do, John, is bring up a family tree.
Yeah.
This family tree, I hope you can see it. You can see it probably easier than I can, but this family tree starts way back in 1622. In the top, the family, as you see, came from Little Houghton. Richard, there are some good things come out of Little Houghton, there are. We've traced the family tree all the way back to down to the bottom right-hand corner, where Elizabeth Sibley marries John Chapman. I want you to focus on that. We're going to come back to that later. Now, the first thing we need to say about this period is one of the things that we get used to in our life is that old people die and young people grow. In the 18th century, that wasn't true, because in the 18th century, young people died, and they died in their tens. infant mortality was very high, even amongst these relatively well-to-do families. The stats indicate that at the middle of the century, a child born only had a 50% chance of making it to 10 years old. So these were dangerous times for children. So in order to simplify this family tree, John, if you can move on to the next one. Yeah. I put black boxes around all the people on the family tree who died before they got to 10 years old. And you can see that it's quite a lot of them, and possibly, Diana, I apologize if that's not true, possibly we've missed some as well. The second thing you'll notice about this family tree is family names, which is great for tradition but didn't make the research any easier. You'll notice amongst the men lots of Richard, Roberts and Johns, and you'll notice amongst the ladies lots of Elizabeth, Marys and Annes. They keep repeating themselves. Now, the second thing that is worth mentioning about the Yeoman family, and if you can move on to the next slide, is that the dynamics of acquiring status and wealth was about marriage. And marriage was important, especially the marriages of the girls. And I highlighted two on this chart because it demonstrates how the Sibleys got to where they got. The first one is in the third generation. You will see that John Sibley married Mary Islip. You'll also, if you look 2 boxes to the left, not boxed, that his sister also married an Islip, Edward Islip. We're tracking down the Islips. Some, we're not sure where they came from, probably Brayfield, maybe Little Houghton, but we're in the middle of tracking them down. And each time one of the ladies married one of the Yeoman Farmers from another village, they acquired just a little more land. But much more important than that, you will see that the second box, by the way, the Islip family is adopted by the Sibleys, and it keeps appearing in their name. They didn't want to let it go. The second box, you will notice that Edward Islip Sibley married none other than Sarah Whalley. And with that would have come a dowry, and with that would have come more land for them to farm. By the time we get to the third generation, there are 2 brothers. The family has taken on 2 arms. You can see there's Islip John Sibley, there's a Robert Sibley, and there's a Richard Sibley. And it looks from the documentation as they went from 1 farm to 2 farms. This is a bit of speculation on our part, but we think that's true. We're going to have a shot a little bit later at deciding which farms they were. The Sibleys all through this period grew. I don't know whether there's any document on this, but I suspect they had their own pews in the church. These Yeoman father families were church wardens. The Hawes were church wardens for a while. The Kilsbys were church wardens for a while. And they had a significant influence on the society of the village. I bring this next slide up, if you could, John, because I think, thank you. It's a newspaper cutting, and Robert, this is one of your newspaper cuttings for which we are extremely grateful for all the things that you've unearthed. And I'm going to read it because I think it's of interest to us. It says on Thursday night, the 22nd of August, some evil disposed person or persons entered the orchards and gardens of nearly all the inhabitants of the parish of Cogenhoe in Northamptonshire and stole the fruit, destroyed the trees and did other very considerable damage. Whoever will give information on the persons who did this mischief shall receive 1 guinea reward. And you will notice on the bottom the names, because that's The names are Higgins, Sibley, Chapman, that we're going to come to in a minute, Blundell Kilsby, Robert Johnson, a Smith here, a Jones, and a Sharman is beginning to enter the village. We're going to talk a little bit more about the Sharmans later on. The Yeoman Farm, this is an age before police forces. If someone raided your back garden, you couldn't pick up a phone, ring a police car, and they came. So yeoman farmers in nearly all the villages of England formed what we would now call vigilante committees, and they combined together to act as law and order in that village, usually to good effect, sometimes probably not quite to such good effect. But those names are the names of the people who lived in the houses down either side of Church Street, because the houses on Church Street fronted onto the street, and because they had the orchards at the back of them on both sides of Church Street. So that is of interest. Now, I've talked a little bit about the Sibleys and who they were, and I'm willing to bet that none of you, including me up to a few weeks ago, had ever heard of the name Sibley. What is this connection to Cogenhoe of the Sibleys? Why did they disappear? What happened to them? And I think we begin to piece together the sequence of events that meant that the Sibleys, from being the second most important family in the village, by the 1830s, there was nobody called Sibley in the village at that time. And I'm going to start the story, again with the thanks to Robert, of the following newspaper cutting. And I'm going to read it because I think you'll be interested in it. On yesterday, another inquisition was taken before the said Mr. Abbey in Cogenhoe, Northampton, to view the body of John Morris, who the day before was killed by John Sibley, a lunatic. Notice it's 1789. The deceased was at work in the fields cutting a hedge when Sibley came up to him, took the unfortunate man's hatchet and gave him 2 mortal wounds, one in the forepart of the neck, which cut through his windpipe, and another on the back of his neck, which cut through his spinal marrow. I guess that would have done it, wouldn't it? He then threw down the hatchet, walked home, seemingly unconcerned, as if nothing had happened. It appeared on the inquest that there was no previous provocation and that not a word passed between the parties at the time. This was a major event, even in the day when violence was commonplace. John Sibley, described as a lunatic, had murdered a Morris, who we'll see a little bit later. He was related to through the Sibleys. It would appear that he was found guilty at the bottom of all that, at the end of all that, but that the Sibleys used their influence to take him back into their home. We're not quite sure on the conditions by which that happened, but it seems that it did happen. And from there on in, the Sibley family seemed to disintegrate. I put up 3 cuttings here, which are not easy to read. I apologize for that. But what they are is, especially the bottom 2, is that they are the bill of sale of the Sibley farms. The Sibleys put the farms up for sale. The one on the right, I think, is Anne Sibley's, and the one on the left is one of the Sibley boys. And the leases on the Sibley's farm were sold. And whether there was any direct connection with the murder and with the disgrace that would have resulted from the murder is obviously difficult to say. The next slide, John, if you could put the family tree back up. Yeah. The next tribe, I've boxed the bottom right-hand corner, and you will see that Elizabeth Sibley married John Chapman. And what happened there is that the Sibleys ran out of men in their hierarchy, as you can see. At the bottom of the tree, most of the other families have come to a short end. There's Mary Sibley has married Joseph Coles. There's that name Coles again, which if we were to do a talk on the 19th century, you would hear a lot of. And Elizabeth Sibley married John Chapman, with the result that all the Sibley farms and their tenements were taken over, were inherited by marriage by a chap called John Chapman. And that confused us for a long time, but you'll see in a minute how relevant that was. So the Sibleys disappeared from the village. I know you got the date, but the last one I think left in about the 1820s, 1830s. The name disappeared from our vocabulary. The Kilsby, however, didn't. They continued on, and they continued well into the 19th century, as we'll see in a minute. Okay, so what I want to do now, if you can bring up the map of the village, 18, yeah. What I'm showing you now is a map of the village in 1829, at the end of the period that we're talking about. And you can see that it really hasn't changed very much from the map you saw of 1630, 200 years earlier. The mill is still there. There's a number of houses surrounding Cotton Farm, and the houses on either side of Church Street are just that. The difference would be that if you walked down that street in 1830, you would recognize the village. You would know all those houses that had been built by the Linwood and built by the Kilsbys and built by the Sibleys. They are the big, strong stone buildings that you see on either side of Church Street and surrounding the green that you see today. And if we look at that village, you bring up the next slide, John. In that village, of 1830. By the way, the map we were looking at is the Enclosure Map, and I'm showing you that for a purpose. In the village were 46 houses, and of the 46 houses, 40, I better call them 46 dwellings, because the enclosure detail, the enclosure schedules doesn't call them houses. There's 46 dwellings, and of those 46 dwellings, 18 are described as houses. And of those 18 houses, 5 are farmhouses. One is the mill, of course, one is the rectory, and one is the manor house. And the other 10 are described as houses, dwellings, houses. So at the time of enclosure, there were 5 farmhouses in the village. Now, what I've done is left Cogenhoe Brand out, by the way, because there was one farmhouse in Cogenhoe Brand by this time, but we won't get into that. In addition to the 18 houses, there were 28 tenements. Now, that's the technical term that is used in enclosures to describe really labourers' cottages. And it's very interesting to see how they were distributed. And I don't want to upset anybody now. Graham, I certainly don't want to upset you, having come new to the village, but most of the tenements were in 2 areas. They were in the area down by Mill Lane, past the green, that bit on the left-hand side at the top of Parsons Close. There was a lot of tenements there. And there were a number of tenements, I think about 5, surrounding Cotton Farm. In those days, I mean, things have changed, of course. In those days, if you lived in that central Church Street, you were probably a yeoman farmer or a member of the Gentry. The less well-off areas were the areas down near Mill Lane and down around Cotton Farm. There were tenements elsewhere, of course, but that was the general concentration. Now, we're going to try and do something now just to try and bring this all together. We're going to try and see where some of these people lived. And to do that, John, if you could bring up the last one slide, the map with the names on either side. We've looked at the enclosure schedules in detail, and this is what they tell us. The thing I want to just mention beforehand is for Chapman, read Sibley, because you remember that the Sibley farms were taken over by Chapman on marriage to the last of the Sibley girls. So he inherited the lot. I might say that he didn't stay in the village very, very long for reasons that we're going to see now. So if we look at this map, John, your house is on here. And of course, a lot of the people in the village now don't live in this central area, but you can recognize the houses and the streets. The first thing I want to do is to point to the right-hand side, and I want to highlight the Kilsby name, because at this time, the Kilsbys were living in the manor house. We saw that they've been living there ever since the Walleys moved to Ecton, or took up in Ecton. And they also owned, probably inhabited, the Manor Farm, which is, you all know Manor Farm. It fronts onto the street. So the Kilsbys were significant players. We begin to see on this map the size of the Chapman holdings, the Sibley holdings, because the Sibleys farmed Cotton Farm, down in the bottom right-hand corner of this map. It looks, if you move up the left-hand side, it looks as if they had the house that Mr. Cotler now lives in. And it also looks as if they have the big house that Annie Walker now lives in. I don't know the name of that very impressive building. But it looks as if the Sibleys, before their demise, had 3 farmhouses in the village. You will also see that the Chapmans also own some of the tenements, or the Sibleys also own some of the tenements, and this would make sense because this is where some of their farm workers would have lived. There was a couple of tenements up Graham, not far from where you live now, up near Mill Lane, and there was 3 tenements around Cotton Farm that the Chapmans and the Sibleys had. So it wasn't until we did this correlation that we realized how important the Sibleys had become. You will also see a number of other names. The house right next to the church was lived in by a chap called Pell, who I think I've seen his name crop up again before. I think he was a church warden for a while, and also may have been in the manor house for a while. And you'll also notice the Sharmans beginning to raise their head, Richard, if I can use that expression. There were 2 tenements, again, next to, near the church, that were owned by the Sharmans. And there was another house over the road, also owned by the Sharmans. Those 2 were brothers, by the way. It wasn't the same Sharman, they were brothers. But I'm not going to talk too much about the Sharmans, because that's more about the 19th century. You will notice that the farmhouse just north of the manor house was still in the hands of the Whalley family at this time. So we begin to see how important those yeoman farmers were in the 19th century. And we're beginning to understand what a real change the Enclosure Act of 1829 caused. That society, that what I call the Jane Eyre society of the 18th century, of land, of title, and of church, which was well regimented, well understood, probably grossly unfair on occasions, but gave stability to societies in the village. That society came dramatically to an end with the Enclosure Act of 1829, because what it did is that it allocated, the Enclosure Act allocated land in the village to really only 2 and a bit individuals. And I'm just going to bring up that, John, if you can bring up the Enclosure Map that Joe Aindo very kindly redrew for us. There's a lot on here, but you can see that the Reverend Watkins, who was the Reverend in the church at this time, and the Wally family sort of divvied up the village between them, which meant that the strips that were farmed by some of the Yeoman farmers were no longer there because the land was enclosed. And we start to see the development of field and hedges, many of which we recognise today. Before this time, of course, there were no fields and hedges to separate the fields. There was just the strips. You will also notice that the Kilsby get an allocation in the enclosure, as did the Gadsbys. And you might say, who are they? Well, the Kilsbys married into the Gadsbys at the end of the 17th century, 18th century. And as a result of that, some of the allocation, a small part of the allocation was made to that family. But from this time onwards, the Watkins and the Wallies became the all-important gentry landowners of the village, but of course, neither one of them lived in the village. So that's given us a rough track through the 18th century. Of course, other significant things happened in the century. In 1741, 42, no, 61, 62, sorry, the river was canalised, which meant that boats went up and down the river, which before they didn't, although that didn't have too much effect on the life at Cogenhoe. And of course, at the end of this period, and the beginning of the next century, we see the beginnings of industrialization, the beginnings of mechanization, the beginnings of population leaving the farms and the land, and we see the beginnings of a whole new society that was very different from this period. I think that's it. I hope it's been educational. And as John said, I'll hand back to you, John, I think, and I'm happy to receive any questions, and we can have a discussion.
Thank you, Ted. Thank you very much indeed. That's excellent. Let me just stop the share. People will need to unmute themselves if they want to speak. Peter, maybe you'd like to say a few words.
Yeah, okay. Thanks, John. Hope everybody can hear me. Ted, I'd like to say thanks very much for doing that. It was a terrific effort, and it was a fabulous journey, bringing up from the earlier part to the to the 1800s. Before I go any further, can we give a round of virtual applause?
Thank you.
Excellent. Excellent. It was fascinating, and there's a huge amount of work by you and your team, and there's obviously a lot more to come. Diane, do you want the right to reply first, as you got a bit abused on there once, didn't you? She's not, oh no, she's on. Have you unmuted, Diane?
Yes, sorry, yes.
Would you like the right to reply to Ted before we ask any questions?
No, he's fine. I think he's done a wonderful job, I mean, I knew he'd turn it into a good story, and it's excellent. I'm very happy to have been a squirrel part of it, so it was, yeah.
Okay. Has anyone got any questions? I can't see everybody, John, so I know that you can. You can probably tell.
No, I can't.
All right. Has anybody got any questions they would like to ask? All right.
Oh.
You've done really well, Ted.
Well, it's quite a while ago now.
Oh, Dinah.
It was one of the list of censuses. And and I think it was 1748, was it? And on the bottom, you'd got some names with A by the side, a small A.
Yeah,
I
I saw
what the significance of that was.
It has a huge amount of significance, and I don't know what that is, Dinah.
Sorry.
There is on the census. There is. Actually, I was the one who did the work on the census, so I can't ask Diana this. There is a significance, and it's something to do with the fact that they moved out, but I can't remember exactly what it was. You will notice on the one of those censuses, the name Samuel Freeman appears. Which, if you read a history of the owners of the estate, the owners of the manor, his name appears for a while. But we think that he was an intermediary to Linwood, and he acted as a go-between in the purchase. But I can't answer your question. But Dinah, I've got your email address. I'll look it up and I'll send you an email.
Okay, thank you.
Ed, 1730, our house was built.
Ah. Well, one of the things that Richard and myself, on a very wet day, put on our boots and we walked down Church Street, and we made a note of how the houses in Church Street related to the Enclosure Map, just to make sure that we got. And one of the things that struck me is that, and I think Stephen Hollowell might have already done some of this, is it would be fascinating to know when each one of those houses was built and the order in which they were built. Now, you telling me that yours was built in 1732?
Not yet.
Well, we have a plaque on the outside.
Not all of it, because our house is 3 cottages. There's 1730 on the side ones, but this front one that we're in now, we think is not the same age.
No.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Well, 1732 would make it a good 60 years after Nathaniel, after Matthew Linwood refurbished and rebuilt the manor house.
Yeah.
It would be interesting to know, you probably notice on the Enclosure Map that the very substantial house on the east side of the green was allocated to Ambrose Eisted. And Ambrose Eisted was Lord of the Manor at Ecton. And I remember, Richard, I see you nodding, I remember Richard or someone telling me they used to be called Ecton Cottages. Yeah, it was a name that was given to them, and that would connect up. But it would be, and it wouldn't be that difficult to do, John, to your point, if we found out the date of each one of those old houses, just to get the sequence of events and how long it took to get from Manor Farm in 1660 some odd to the village as we now know it, how long that took, whether it was 40 or 50 years. I do know from my study of the English village that there were 2 periods of house building in the 18th century, a bit like there is in our own century. You know, the 1960s, there were houses going up. The first one was 1720 to 1740, which sounds as if it's when the date of your house. And the second one was 1765 to about 1795. So it could well be that the houses that were built in the 18th century in Cogenhoe drop into those two periods. I think it would be good to find out the actual date of each one of the houses. Maybe we should do that.
The name Pell appeared for the first time. Do they figure very much, or was it just who were they, or was it just a fleeting sort of visit in the general figure of things, really?
What's that? Sorry, John.
The name Pell, which
Pell.
came,
no, the name crops up quite a lot.
Right.
And I made a mental note. You're not listening to this, Diana. you're not listening. I'm not going to ask you to do another family tree. I made a note to ask Diana to see whether she could dig out their family tree, because I came across their name in connection with the Manor House. But certainly in the Enclosure Act, the house immediately next to the church, I think was given to Mr. Pell. So I assume he lived there. And next door to him were two tenements, which were given to Mr. Sharman, and in the Enclosure Act. So Richard will probably dig out why they got those beforehand. But I don't know anything more about Pell other than that the name keeps cropping up.
So we could find him.
Yeah, we can find him. And whether he was more prominent in the 19th century than the 18th century, I don't know.
Ted, you got a question from David Williams, I think.
Yes, thank you. Susan and I are relative newcomers to the village, and you mentioned Cogenhoe Grand or Brand, was it?
Yes. David, that was a whole talk in its own right. There's a bit of land. I'll do this very quickly because we talked about this, but very good question. There's a bit of land 7 miles to the south of Cogenhoe, in between Stoke Goldington and Ravenstone and Horton, which is called Cogenhoe Brand, and it was part of Cogenhoe Parish for nearly 500 years. It was we lost it in 1884, and we got it in when was it, 1558. So from 1558 to 1884, it was part of Cogenhoe Parish. And interestingly enough, Di, I will cover this if I may. We thought that Cogenhoe Brand was geographically and socially separate from Cogenhoe, because it was 7 miles away, which is sort of half a day in a horse and cart. We are now finding that the tenant farmers who farm Cogenhoe Brand intermarried with the yeoman fathers of Cogenhoe. So we now got 2 marriages, I think, Diane, where one with a Godfrey is the name, where a daughter of Cogenhoe married the yeoman farmer in Cogenhoe Brand, and we've also got an example of the reverse. So we're finding that Cogenhoe Brand wasn't as separate as we thought it was, and it is possible that because and Eddie would have more knowledge on this than I have. It's possible that because it was obligatory to attend church during much of this period, it may have been that some of the inhabitants of Cogenhoe Brand had to attend Cogenhoe Church as opposed to either Ravenstone or Horton Church. But we are finding that there was an interconnectivity between Cogenhoe Brand and the village that we didn't realise existed. Because we thought it was probably quite separate, and in fact Cogenhoe was part of Ravenstone. Di.
I'm sitting here with the Ordnance Survey map trying to find it, and I haven't managed to. So
you won't find it on the Ordnance Survey map, I'm afraid, David. What you will find of interest is a farm in the middle of it called Cheney Farm. And that it's got its name because it's named after the Lord of the Manor at Cogenhoe. Diana, you've got your hand up.
Thank you.
Yeah, I was just going to say, you know, when you referred to the Chapmans, I didn't know whether you were holding this little sort of piece for another time, because that reflected how the Sibleys were still in control, because we had this interesting thing where the Chapman, who was described as the late Chapman on the 1829 enclosure, and we assumed it was because he died, but in actual fact it turned out it was because he had married again one of the influential Elizabeth Sibleys and had inherited that farm, and then because the lady died very young and he remarried and produced yet more children, some of whom weren't quite fitted with the local sort of genre. And when Elizabeth Sibley died, the Walleys and the Sibleys took the land back from them. So that was the guy. He then went up to live with his son at Wollaston, but his natural son, who would have been Sibley's son, he actually moved to Wollaston on the Green. So basically, although he inherited the farms from the Sibleys by his marriage to Elizabeth Sibley, once that marriage ended by death and he remarried, the Sibley family quickly took the land back and into the Whalley thing. That was our original assumption in the end, when we couldn't understand why it wasn't the late Chapman wasn't dead. It was the farm that was the late that they took back. So they were then pulling all their land back so that it didn't go off to a chain of a family that had nothing to do with the village, because he came, I think, from Moulton, I think was from memory, was where Chapman's came.
Yeah, what we were trying to do for everybody's benefit, we were trying to find out why the Sibleys disappeared effectively, because they were clearly movers and shakers, as Di just said, there was a sequence of events, some of them about people dying, some of them about the murder, some of them about remarriage, as Diane said, and this was all somewhat of a revelation to us, because you know, we'd never until we started this, we never heard of the Sibley name, quite frankly. I might just add, because I know Robert's listening, Robert has unearthed quite a lot of information that the Sibleys were also significant people in Northampton. A chap called Josiah Sibley was nominated to be the MP in the 18th century, together with Gunnings, who were lords of the manor at Taunton House, and one or two other very important people. So the Sibleys were important in Cogenhoe, but they were also other sides of the family, not the same family as ours, but connected to them, were also movers and shakers in Northampton as well.
Okay, any other questions? I'm sure Ted's desperate for a glass of water, which unfortunately I couldn't give you.
Actually, Peter, I've got a big stiff brandy right on
I wondered about that, Ted, yes. Anyway, if there are no more questions, Ted,
Richard's got one.
Oh, Richard, go on, Richard.
Well, it might be sort of a trail of the 19th century. But just probably adding or maybe confusing those two Sharman tenements next to the church.
Right.
I was looking in the 1851 census, as you do, of Cogenhoe, and I found there were two Sharman, Edward and Thomas Sharman, next door, and described it as Rose Hill Cottage. Now, whether that rings any bells or it just is a confusion, I don't know. So that's them, possibly. And the other thing is, John, could you go back to the Sibley family tree?
Yes, hang on a sec. I'll just have to share the screen again, just a moment. I'm just trying to go back.
God, you're good at this, John. You're really good. Oh,
which one? That one?
That one.
Well, you mentioned that down the bottom you've got Elizabeth Sibley, but on the left-hand side you've got Mary Sibley, married Joseph Coles. It just sort of brings it, well, it's family, because the Joseph Coles had that family noticed as Mary down there. Well, Mary married James Coles Sharman, who was my great-great-grandfather.
Oh, wow.
Of course, it's not incestuous, I hope, but you remember the name of the Hoare family, going back. Richard Hoare came from Milton, married. Richard Sharman married from Milton, married. Was it Mary Hoare?
Anne Hoare.
Anne Hoare, that's right.
Yeah.
One of their offspring was Anne Sharman, who married David Deacon, who was my great-great-grandfather. So
there you go.
All comes round. What goes round comes round.
Wow.
But that's
we during this project we've become uncomfortably aware that every time we meet Richard we have to bow a little.
Belted Earl.
Okay, any other questions at all? Otherwise, we'll sign off and let Ted have his brandy.
Yeah.
Once again, Ted, thanks for a fascinating talk.
Thank you. Yeah.
Brilliant.
Pleasure, pleasure. Glad to be with you.
Thank you.
We're welcome.
Yeah, thank you everybody for organising it. Yeah.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, pleasure. And just leaves me to say, have a happy Christmas, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Merry
Christmas. And a happy New Year.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
A healthy
Cheers.
New Year.
Yes.
Nice to see you all.
Bye then. Bye.
Peter, do you want the committee to have a quick word or
Leave.
Why not?
Peter's gone.
He's gone.
Right.
See you
Bye
tomorrow.
all.
See you tomorrow, John.
Yes, indeed.
Another matter, yes.
Indeed.
Okay, bye-bye.
Cheers.